Hello, and welcome to episode number 7 of Islington Mill and, a monthly podcast series about the cultural life of one of the UK's most beloved artist-led creative hubs, Salford's Islington Mill. I am your host, The Nihilist, and for this month's episode of Islington Mill and, I'm joined by guests Charles Lauder and Rivca Rubin to discuss the linguistic practice they have founded, which is known as Upwording. Rivca has previously appeared on Islington Mill and in episode number 3 to discuss Upwording with me, and I would recommend listening to that if you want a potted history of what the practice entails. But for this episode, Rivca is joined by Charles Lauder, who also founded the practice with her, and we're going to take a more in-depth discussion of what it actually means and the practical applications of Upwording in our day-to-day lives, and specifically here at Islington Mill. How Upwording has been and continues to be used in this space, where the concept came from, and its potential applications in more general day-to-day life. I'm not going to have a very long intro for this podcast, I'm just going to get straight to the interview. Here is Charles Lauder and Rivca Rubin and myself, the Nihilist, discussing Upwording. Charles Lauder and Rivca Rubin, welcome to Islington Mill and podcast, although Rivca, you've been on this a couple of times already, and you're back this month to talk about Upwording. So I'm going to field you guys a very easy, simple, straightforward question to start with. What is Upwording?
It's a number of things. Some people call it a movement. It's definitely an invitation, a proposal, an offer. Many call it a practice.
A practice of what?
It's a practice based on our belief, and one that's shared by others, that our habitual current use of language tends to be, whether intentionally or not, coercive, hierarchical, littered with labelling, as in you are a, I am a, to the detriment of how we actually communicate, and definitely to the detriment of us seeking to have positive, useful interchange that can be beneficial to all parties.
Okay, and how does Upwording, when put into practice, manage to have a more positive interaction with people?
Start with something really simple.
Okay.
2 3-letter words. But and.
Yeah.
If you say something to me and I respond with yes, but, pretty much everything you hear from me after that but, you will perceive as a rebuttal of what you said. I could say almost exactly the same words. If they're prefaced by and, your response is different. And you can try it for yourself in your own mind at the moment. Hear a but or an and. With an and, you move to a position of, oh, what I've said has been accepted and is now being built upon. With a but, it's a, let's push that aside and put something in its place.
Sure.
And that's one of the simplest, and certainly the one that I use the most commonly as an example of what we're looking at when we're talking about Upwording.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and also I feel like that as an example is very straightforward. Would there be another example? Could you develop on that a bit more with perhaps another example of but and very straightforward ways of? It's quite easy in my head when I think about making statements to substitute the word and for the word but. But is there more to it is there like deeper levels of what Upwording may be? Other examples of a more complex kind of take on what that might mean in practice?
I want to go in 2 directions at the moment.
Okay.
Maybe the more complex you are asking for could be that the use of the but at that moment puts the weight on what I'm going to say and brings down or evaluates that which you have maybe or somebody else has put forward as lesser. So therefore it's also an example of superiority.
Okay.
I will elevate my contribution, but even if I go, I agree with you, but I think, and I'm going to use another word that we would question, we should do it this way.
And the word in that statement of your question is?
Should.
Okay.
So in this case, the but and the should, I have just elevated myself into a position above you.
Okay, this is kind of what I was getting at when I asked the question in terms of substituting the word and for the word but. It's very straightforward and it seems like a very positive thing to do, but that seems more like a reflection of just my own personal usage of language. If I was interacting with either one of you individually, I could try doing that. But what I'm getting at, I think, with what I'm trying to ask is something that's a bit more like approaching the systems of language that we use and how language is used in general in the world today as we live in it, rather than just my own personal usage of language.
Okay. When we do sessions introducing people to upwording, one of the first things we ask is, how would you not like to be spoken to?
Okay. How would I not like to be spoken to? Okay, that's a direct
Even
question
how
to me.
can you really not bear being spoken
Bear
to,
being
or even
spoken
hate
to.
being spoken to?
It's got to do with context, but I'd say if we can go for like the most universal context, it's something that's a bit too commanding and feels a bit like I'm being spoken down to, especially if I'm in a situation where I feel like perhaps my knowledge base is better and bigger than the person who's speaking to me, and then they start talking to me in a way that makes me feel inferior to them. Yeah, like I'm trying to think of of an actual example to give for this, but I don't know, in general terms, some field that I work in where I'm very skilled, and then somebody's come in to employ me in a freelance basis, but they don't know exactly what they're trying to say or what they want from me, and then they start commanding me in ways that I know aren't correct. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? Yeah.
So the things I've just heard were commanding, being spoken down to, some people would call that being patronised. And there's a few others that people, when we introduce this, when we ask the questions, come up with, so check if you might like them. Aggressively.
Sure.
Do you like being spoken to aggressively?
Not particularly, yeah, but you know, there are some contexts.
When you give consent.
When you can give consent to, yes.
Yeah.
I don't like to be too prescriptive about how any individual uses language, because I do believe that language is a tool that we all have the right to use in individual ways. Yeah. And for instance, in some of my work, I like to deliberately use language that is used against me pejoratively and try to turn it into a positive thing. So when you're asking about ways I don't like being spoken to in, I have to be clear that the context is specific or not from this specifically niche context that I may sometimes inhabit in my own personal usage of language, because I can sometimes use language in an aggressive way, but where people are consenting to that and they enjoy it.
So the operative here is the consent.
Yes.
So taking the command, which is also being ordered, and that is an interesting one because people do go, yeah, but I'm okay with being ordered. Mm-hmm. In fact, I might even like it. So the liking will be consent.
Yeah.
Order me.
Yeah. Tell
me what to do. If that is without consent, then so far we've noticed that everybody, and I'm saying that very carefully, goes, no, I don't like being told what to do unless I've given my consent. Or I specifically join a group of people where that I even contractually sign, the army, the police force, or any other organisation, where I absolutely agree I will be told without questioning it.
Yes. Yeah.
So others that come up within the I don't like, and we mean by I don't like, is it motivating? Is it helpful? Does it really invite to enjoyable action? So you went commanded, being patronised, being spoken down to. Then there's the aggressively, there's the being compared, being judged, being labelled.
Yeah. Again,
very different to I might give myself a label. Being being labelled by others in a different way, people don't seem to particularly like, unless it's a nice one, of course.
Yeah.
And how do you tend to respond when being spoken to like that without your consent?
the consent? Not well. Angers me. Not in a kind of very low level. Not in a very like I'm going to act out on my anger, but it can instill in me a kind of low level anger that will sit with me for quite a while, for like a few hours or maybe even an entire day, depending on what the incident was. Yeah, but it is good that you have cleared up the area of context around it though as well, because certain people do seek out to be commanded, but then again they're asking for in an ideal situation they'll be asking for that and they'll be overtly giving their consent for that to happen. But when it does happen to you and you're not consenting to it, for instance like traffic jam or something like that, just some kind of like situation that we find ourselves in every day that can ramp up our anxieties and make us feel unhappy. Yeah, being spoken to by, for instance, a complete stranger who has like cut you off and then shouts at you, or somebody shouts something rude and derogatory at you from a car going by, like, we don't consent to that, really.
Or even, you have to finish that report on Friday.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Being
must
told,
be done like this.
Yes, yeah.
This is how it's done.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're getting at when we talked about, when I spoke about earlier, about coercion and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's clear if you're being ordered that there is a degree of coercion involved.
Yes,
as Rivca said earlier, the position that the other person is taking is one that says that I am superior to you, which is a hierarchical. Mm-hmm. Which of these words would you say describe what you were talking about in terms of how you respond? Resist?
That can definitely be an element of it, yeah. Again, that's very contextual, but I think when you're given a non-consenting order, I think it's a natural reaction to resist, to go no, because I didn't like that. So internally, my natural dislike of that brings up, don't do it then. But that might not be the correct.
So there's a part of, it might even be a rebellion.
Yes, yeah,
I'm
yeah,
definitely
absolutely.
not going to do it. I would have done it if you had asked me nicely to take the bins out. You've told me to take the bins out. I'm definitely not going to take them out.
Yeah.
The resisting might be, I may take them out. I'll definitely do it later, slower and with a bit less energy.
Mm-hmm. And I might not bother to make sure that everything that should be in the bins actually is, because you just said take the bins out.
Yeah.
So that'll show you.
I'll do a half-assed job because I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
I may refuse to even engage in any further conversation and walk away.
Yeah.
Or, here's one other one is, I may resign and I may do it because the power over that you hold in the relationship to me, by your role, by your age, by
circumstance.
Yeah, may mean that I have too much fear to do the rebelling and resisting and to take an action that's rebellious or resisting. I might still feel it. I will resign and I will do it. And I would say that comes at pretty high cost. That's eroding a real sense of self.
Yeah.
So it becomes harmful, and the whole thing about upwording is about noticing what in our current vocabulary of how we engage with one another and with ourselves is hindering rather than helpful.
Yeah.
Demotivating rather than motivating, even harmful.
Yeah, because as you're talking about it, I'm now picturing myself, like, currently I'm self-employed and I produce podcasts for a living, which is a great thing for me. But in the past, thinking back to when I was doing work that I didn't particularly want to do, or I was in an office situation, and it was that thing where you would get asked or ordered to do something in a way that you didn't respond very well to, and then you would do, like I said, you would do a half-assed job, and it does erode at your idea of self-worth, I feel, because if you then are like, why am I doing this? I shouldn't be doing this, and that's circular, and then it will take you down a path of, like, I shouldn't be here, I shouldn't be doing this, which all these things may be true, but they're not going to get you through the moment in that place when you're doing that thing very well.
And how do you think that impacts on the relationship that you would have
with the person who gave the command?
And indeed with yourself in that context?
Not well at all. Resentment. In terms of the relationship with the person giving the command, I think that would build up a sense of resentment. Again, there are different factors to different things, but when I think about this sort of thing and how this would have happened in my own life, for instance, I'm thinking back to one of my particular jobs now, I'm thinking back to one of the kind of line managers who would walk the floor, and the way, particularly the ones who didn't do it very well. It would build up a sense of resentment, because on the one hand, I would be like, I don't think I should be doing this, or I could do this better than you. And all these negative emotions then impact on the relationship of power that you have with the person who is your boss, or who is your line manager, and who is giving you commands. And from my point of view, I think that would build up into resentment, negative feelings, like you said earlier, Rivca, not wanting to do it, or not wanting to do, and you said Charles, doing, like I said, half-assed, doing a not very particularly good version. I think maybe to prove a point to them somehow, that like, I'm worth more than this, or something like that. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing in there is, it's not good for the work, because it won't be the best job.
Yeah.
It's not good for the relationship, and it's not good for you. Because as you say, not only do you not do your best, which means you're less likely to be proud of what you've done, the chances are that you take that feeling away with you.
Yeah.
It could ruin your day, it could impact on everything else that you do thereafter. So what we're saying and suggesting is that if we engage differently from the beginning, the potential for that to be a successful, mutually successful outcome will increase.
Cool.
Because if we choose to engage differently from the beginning, i.e. without any form of hierarchy present in the communication, even if in my roles I may have a place in a hierarchical structure, it doesn't require me to speak from a position above you at any time, then we may also find that I do find we can actually focus on what maybe is being brought to the table, whether that is a request and the impact that doing that request or not doing that request would have. It may be something that I want to bring to you or somebody else's attention. Because if maybe we do it differently together, we again have even more of a mutually beneficial outcome. Whereas if the language I choose around it is evaluative, it's not good enough. Picking up on the words good, better, worse, which were there before, or in some way I am labeling you into something, or even blaming or shaming you or commanding you or telling you what you should or ought to do according to me, then, like you just said, you might spend a lot of time just trying to bring yourself back up to the same level, rather than actually ever addressing what the content of our conversation could be, or was hoped for.
I think that's why when you use the word context, I think, Rivca, you sort of linked that with intent. I think if the intention is for a mutually beneficial outcome, then you'll do almost anything in order to try to achieve that. And if the language can assist that process, why would you not engage with it?
Whereas if the intention is to get you to do what I want you to do, or how I want you to do it, or the intention is to educate you, make you pay for something that I don't like that you did, blame, shame, or frame you, or in some way control you and coerce you, well, actually, I'll begin to coerce you, then that is going to be felt and will be met by the retaliation, the rebellion, the resistance.
Yeah. The reason that I brought up my own personal context of my kind of situations I've been in where this seems very relevant is it seems very common now that you're articulating and I'm thinking about it. It seems very common and something that we encounter all the time in the day-to-day world, just out there in the real world. But I want to know, where did Upwording come from?
It's because when you say out there in the real world, there's also out in here in the real world, and I'm pointing to my head at the moment.
Yeah.
The real world is also very much what is going on in here. Again, with the choice of vocabulary I use, not only towards another person, about another person, towards myself and about myself. Because all that damage or hindering can be done to oneself in the way we evaluate ourselves, position ourselves, blame, shame ourselves, and even make ourselves do things, the self-commanding things of I have to. Your question, we can pick that up in a minute, was where does it come from? I would say it's probably come from the moment language was invented.
Okay.
More recently, in that how I've become aware of the impact of the words that we choose to speak or think upon ourselves and others is very strongly through nonviolent communication. Which has been around since the 70s, mainly the 2000s.
Okay.
Before that, up to a point, also neuro-linguistic programming has really looked into that. I'd say most studies around therapy, psychology, already have a lot of developed awareness around that the way we speak to ourselves and to each other has an impact. A detrimental one or a really supportive one. What hasn't happened so much yet, and I think nonviolent communication is the root here around basic human needs and how we meet them and how they might be threatened by not just our actions but our words, which are actions, is we haven't really yet chosen to pay attention to the vocabulary that we choose to use or use habitually, as Charles, you said before, even without realising, and we could argue unintentionally, could unpack that, at times, just by the sheer habit of it, and to actually notice how much impact that can create around, towards others and in the whole world.
I think that's one of the reasons why we talked about that whole thing when we said about upwording, that it's an invitation.
Okay.
In the first instance, I think it's an invitation to have a degree of self-awareness, to start being aware of the words that we use and how we use them, and also then of awareness of others. You know, get the antenna up to see, how's that landing? When I say that, what kind of response and or probably more importantly, what kind of reaction do I get? And if I change it, what then happens? So that's why I did the but and as a very simple thing and say you can do that with yourself. You don't even have to wait until someone else is around. Similarly, when Rivca was saying that how we talk to ourselves, imagine the conversations we have sometimes before you go into, I don't know, an important meeting. And the self-doubt kicks in and this other voice starts, I mustn't, or have to, must remember to. And how often does that actually start demotivating you with regard to this important session? Because we're using those command and blame, shame, whatever expressions in talking to ourselves in making the preparation.
And here is a question. Is there actually anything that we have to do? Is there anything any of us must do?
In life? The big question? And you're asking me that? Okay.
Is there anything you have to do?
Me personally, what I have to do and what I felt has been the most beneficial to me on a personal level is to follow my artistic desires and my creativity and to try and let that flourish as much as I possibly can in my day-to-day life. I felt that since I've come into a period of my life where I've been able to do that again, thankfully. My life feels a lot more better. I feel a lot more centred, and I feel I am able to engage in better relationships with people in general, because I feel a lot more centered and grounded in myself, because I feel like I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing. At least that's how I feel in my head.
And who told you you had to do that?
Nobody told me I had to do that. I feel it was just a feeling. But also there were circumstances in my life where certain things came to a head, and I felt like if I don't do this, or if I don't stop this other thing and do the thing that I want to do, I'm really scared of where I will end up both mentally and physically.
Right.
So it wasn't necessarily something that was directly being commanded to me to do, but it was still a desire that I had.
So
and
how
I felt
did
that
it
I had
happen?
to
How did it then happen? So there wasn't a direct command.
Mm-hmm.
It's a realization that you had.
Mm-hmm.
What took it to taking that action or step?
Well, when you're asking me this personally, I've also feel I've had a very lucky run of things in my life, especially recently. I was working in healthcare when the pandemic started, and that was the reason why I just knew that I had to end that line of work for myself, because not only was it physically dangerous, it was also mentally very, very taxing. But then thankfully I came here to the mill, and there were some opportunities that were afforded to me here in the mill, and it felt like a very good grounded place to try and get back stuff like working in a music studio, building a music studio again, and having people, artists and stuff around me and facilitating their work.
Great. So you came to the mill.
Mm-hmm.
You chose to come to the mill?
Yes, yeah.
Or you had to come to the mill?
Chose to come to the mill, yeah.
Okay. And that's the point we're making. The moment we take an action, this, however long we may have had that realization, or have been in the job that doesn't work anymore, or in a relationship, or whatever, it might be around choice of food or whatever, it is always when we make a choice that something happens.
Yeah.
So the point really is that everything that we do is a choice, because we might tell ourselves all these things that we have to do. That doesn't mean we do any of them or all of them. Hence the lists, the have to do lists are very, very long and often don't get done at all. So have to doesn't actually lead to action.
True. Okay.
There is a little step which is a choose to. So the difference is I might go, I have to go to work, in which case I'll probably start blaming you or others or somebody for, well, I'm the only one is, I've got to carry on, I've got to bring in all the living, or the state tells me whatever. There's externalized responsibility and pressure and blame. Or I may go, I am going to work because I still want to bring in that level of income. I don't like the job.
Yeah.
And I'm much more likely to make a change.
I'd go so far as to relate a conversation that I had with my mother ages ago, which puts a context that we're seeking to engage with when we talk about, do you really have to? And she said, once you're born, the only thing you have to do is die, because we've yet to work out a way not to. And I said, yeah, but you have to eat. And she said, no, people go on hunger strike. I've got to breathe. No, you could tape your nose and mouth up. The point she was making was that everything other than dying, we have some element of agency and choice within that. And so that's what we're getting at when we say that this sense that have to presses down on us in a way that isn't liberating and doesn't move towards, I come back to this, a beneficial outcome.
And so have to, must do, need to, should do, ought to are all vocabulary of used to coerce others, each other and oneself. So they are part of the mechanics or the vocabulary, the tools you might call it, of superiority and authoritarian systems.
Yeah.
You cannot make people do things or keep them in line or on a leash without having the vocabulary to do so. I cannot suppress you or oppress you. without some vocabulary. I may not have the physical strength to do that to 10 people. I can certainly create structures, hierarchical structures of superiority and authoritarianism. I require a cursive language or a language around that makes that happen.
There's an interesting thing that you mentioned about what brought you to the mill, because I think that might be a useful segue for what it is that the relationship between Upwording and the mill is.
Definitely. Before we get there, though, I just want to say that was really good, because when we have talked about Upwording in the past, you and me, Rivca, and why I was wanting to ask quite specifically where it's come from, in that there are concepts within what you've talked to me about previously that are very this is NLP, this is neuro-linguistic programming. But what I like about, in this discussion, what we're getting more towards, is that, to me, neuro-linguistic programming, I don't know that much about it, I'm not trained in it, but my knowledge of it, it seems very based on just an individual's internal monologue or thought process with themselves. And what's interesting to me is what you said there about analysing systems of authority and control and power, and how language is used within those systems. And Upwording, to me, seems like a much more direct focus on that kind of thing, and the kind of how systems of authority use language to coerce. Whereas neurolinguistic programming is, to me, of my little limited knowledge of it, seems very, it's a bit it's like a good example. I mean, this is kind of around the bend example, but kind of self-help or a diet thing that was just going just eat loads of quinoa and then eat loads of blah 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 fresh food, but you live in a place and you have a certain amount of income that means that you can only really buy food of a certain quality, so you don't have the ability to do those things that would be better for you, because there are systems in place and systems of power and control in place that haven't been analysed by the person who's just saying, just eat more quinoa or eat less fatty food. It's actually, the only choice I have when I've come out at the end of the day and I have £1.50 is to go get a bag of chips for £1.50, because a bag of quinoa costs £2. And this is kind of what I was trying to get at with the second question I asked you about kind of an example that was beyond but and, because to me, the really fascinating thing about all of this is the scrutiny on systems of power and control that we live under, that we kind of feel they kind of have an invisibility to them. And it's really, really nice when people are actually analysing those things and saying, this is how power works. Because power is something that, even within very politically focused and politically progressive, for want of a better word, spaces and places, power is something that is very, very rarely talked about. Because even those spaces themselves have systems of power within them that need to be analysed and stuff. And I just really like that Upwording seems to be at least approaching this and at least acknowledging that this is a fact, rather than, for me, neurolinguistic programming seems very much like a thing, you just go away and do this and your life will be better. Whereas, my life can't be better until I can, criticise the system of control I live under that makes me feel crap.
I think that's very much part of what we're saying, which is that this is a prescription that will fix everything. We don't believe so, and we would definitely not seek to present it as so. It's also one of the things that we said, that's why that word invitation is so important, that you can come on board to whatever extent and as regularly or otherwise as works for you. It's recognising the level of agency that you have in terms of your own use of language.
Yeah.
And if you are in a position where you are with others who are receptive, you can start working with each other. Rivka and I still do it. Every once in a while we'll be in a conversation and I'll say something and there'll be a bit of a pause and then Rivka will say, "Oh, you have to, do you?" And it's a gentle reminder. Or equally, somewhere in the middle of something, I've said, and Rivka will say, but. And I'll go, "Oh, right, okay."
Yeah.
Rebutting my work then.
Yeah. And we do that with humour, so I'm just going to pick up, because the tone there, so you have to, do you, would be between us.
Yes.
If somebody else goes, "I have to," I would just go, "Is that something you want to?"
Okay.
So there's no kind of a tone of taking the piss. That was a nice little that's the humour one when you've got a relationship with someone. Go, really?
Yeah.
No, really? Do you have to? And they go, well, no, I don't have to. I choose to.
Yeah.
People jump quite quickly to go, no, I want to, or going, nah, not really. It's something that I find really important. So is that something you're willing to do? Mm-hmm. Are we willing to? And that also comes to when it's not just when it is beyond myself and yourself. As a team,
Yeah.
if we let go of any notion that there's anything we have to do, then we begin to communicate around the things that we have agreed to do.
Yeah.
We have agreed to meet the criteria of an engagement, whether it's with a fund or etc. So it is always a conscious choice. So what we're inviting is to become much more aware of conscious choice making rather than the choice making happening anyway, being unconscious and then being apportioned to an externalized responsibility. I only followed orders.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is that when you interrogate your own use of language in that way, you get to a position where you have a recognition of what the outcome is that's motivating the action. Mm-hmm. So Rivca used the expression before, going to work. I may not wish to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go in to whatever it is I'm doing. However, the money that I make by doing that means that I can go on holiday to some really gorgeous places twice a year. Mm-hmm. That changes my relationship to the getting up at 6 o'clock because I know what the impact is that's coming from this thing that I'm now choosing to do.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I don't require any of those words because I'm beginning to realize I am making choices all the time, including how I respond to something. What amount of energy do I put into the response? How do I want to respond? How else could I respond? How else could I frame something, understand something, read something? And it might be that I get up in the morning, I go to work, and noticing what happens to myself and to others if I just leave out all this have to, because all the have tos and need tos are also part of that stress list, something around all these things that we have to do. If we have many of those things we have to do, therefore it means I'm busy.
Yeah.
If I'm busy, therefore I have value.
Okay.
That works really well within the capitalist system.
Yeah, absolutely.
I quantify, I see my value as the quantity of all these things I have to do. I'll probably get into a competition with people around me going, God, yeah, I can see you're really stressed. I've got all of that to do and my neighbour's dog is ill and I've got to look after that. So we then up each other on the amount of things we have to do and how stressed we are, because stress is the only evidence that I'm busy and therefore I'm important.
Yeah.
And yet we're constantly talking about the problems of stress and the impact it has on health.
Yeah.
So a first thing that we can easily do if we want to reduce stress for oneself and each other is just drop all the have tos, need tos, must dos, should dos, got tos, and go, I am doing. Maybe I'm not doing, I'm choosing not to. I'm willing to, I'm prepared to. I want to. In fact, I can't wait to, I'd love to. When?
And I play a little game with myself sometimes, even now, where when I find myself moving into have to, must, shoulds, little bell goes off and the voice says who?
That is, yeah, that's me.
So another way of thinking of that is, I might go, actually I want to improve my health and well-being and my energy and I would like to impact on other people. So therefore, I'm definitely not going to use any cursive vocabulary because I know it just adds to stress. And actually, no, we don't have to. We are making choices. We'll be a lot healthier. That's one way. That's a personal. That's around health. That's around respect. That's around being with rather than above, or it's a power with rather than a power over. Another thing I could be thinking of is that every time that I reach for or fall into using any of those words, and there are many others, I am actually inadvertently, or in this case, maybe consciously, upholding authoritarian systems.
Okay, how about I have to pay the rent, says who? My landlord. Why? I'll go to jail.
And what if you rephrase that into, I want to pay the rent because I want to keep living here.
Yes.
And I don't want to get on the wrong side of my landlord.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
And if want doesn't please enough because it's too much, well, I don't really want to pay that level of rent.
Well, maybe I don't,
I will pay that rent for now.
For those reasons.
For those reasons. In fact, I'm going to start looking at somewhere else to live that is of a lower rent.
Okay.
Or just I will pay it. I am paying the rent. I don't agree with it. I'm going to do something around it.
Yeah.
I could also choose to refuse to pay the rent. I could then be thrown out. I might want it to go to a court case. I might want that to be the precedent for the rents being too high, and I'm going to get the newspaper involved.
Yeah.
We have a number of choices that we can make. I could also go, I don't want to pay the rent anymore. Can you start paying the rent because you haven't paid for 6 months? Or I can try and meet people who have more money than me and they can pay the rent. The point is there are options.
Yeah.
At least some options. And when there's no options available, when we have very little control over what is happening to us, we still have the possibility of choosing how to respond in that moment.
Yeah.
That's
of course.
the last of our given freedoms, is how to respond in any given circumstance.
Cool. Right, so Charles, you already mentioned the mill. So I'm going to rewind the conversation a little bit back and ask about what is the relationship between Upwording and Islington Mill, where we are at the moment recording the podcast, and how is Upwording being used here at the mill? Is it being used here at the mill? Are there examples you could give?
How did it get here and how is it used? Okay, well, it got here because I started being invited to do some work here, still as a freelancer. And the work that I did then and still do, we both do, is to work with teams and organizations in assisting them to develop their communications in such a way that everybody is a much more satisfied, willing member of the team, the community, the organization.
Okay.
So I came in already with an idea of how to assist people in developing communication or how to avoid conflict or tension, maybe how to deal with them if they do come up. So with my arrival and then doing a number of things within the organisation as a freelancer, and I'm just going to jump to that because that was on the last podcast, is I'm one of the 4 people in the shared artistic director role. And that's together with Bill Campbell, with Maurice Carling and with Rachel Goodyear, and who came on training that we did, I think already back then in 2015, 2016, and Upwording really came about or got articulated as this movement practice in 2016. So they were quite early on with the learning, and actually we prefer the word learning to training. I just noticed they used the word training, so remove that one, share it to learning, sharing. That included also coaching and how to give feedback in a way that people can and want to hear it and do something with it. So as we started working closer with each other, Moray, Bill, Rachel and myself, we really made a decision to use Upwording basically by really noticing our vocabulary, noticing what that reveals and shifting it. So I'd say that certainly the biggest example we've just used throughout this conversation today is the coercive command, the demand, the have tos, must tos, need tos, and also the shoulds, which also then come under unsolicited advice and highly with a moralistic superiority thrown in there as well, how it should be done. We don't use those between us and with others. It is very, very rare that one of those words enter the room. When they do, we choose to notice what is going on. And often there is a pressure that may come from outside somewhere that has suddenly brought in with it that pressure, and it manifests in the should do or need to do. And we notice it and we shift it. We go back into conscious decision making rather than the reacting to.
Yeah.
With it, there's more around upwording and its vocabulary. It's around the choosing not to label other people, or even oneself. That's a big other area. I think we could have a separate podcast on. And it's certainly around not apportioning any blame, or even looking for who's guilty or who's done something. We don't use right or wrong. Those kind of evaluative, binary, polarized judgments. Instead, what takes place is a curiosity, is wanting to find out, is taking something and learning from it. How can we prevent it from happening again? How can we do it differently? What is going on? So it also moves from, more often than not, from being furious about something to becoming curious as to what went on. So between the fours, we really do. We very consciously have made an effort. It's become habitual now. It's the new habitual. And I'm specifically going habitual rather than normal, because normal is one of the words that also we would go, please let's watch this idea of normal, because with normal comes abnormal. So how about if we just let go of that word and let it go into the archive?
Much like the concept itself, I feel. I think that's something that's been happening since lockdown very plainly showed people that their conception of normal usually comes from an outside power structure, and is used to constrain and control people. And when people were put into a literal life or death situation, like myself, we decided to make choices to follow life paths that weren't based around what was seen as being normal, quote unquote. And I feel like one of the things that is causing so much tension in the world right now, that is being expressed, I mean there's a lot of things, but one of the things I feel is a kind of death of normal, the realization that there is no normal. So these kind of like dreams that people have of kind of like, you know, their general day-to-day aspirations of what makes them feel quote unquote normal, that stuff was all rubbish, and it was never fulfilling in the first place anyway. And I feel that that's a real reality of something that has happened, I feel, since the pandemic, because it's forced people to confront that. Yeah,
it's also, the use of the term is the basis on which we can then other
absolutely
those who are not normal. And I think very strongly that it's one of, Rivca made reference to the sort of binary terms, that as soon as you move into that, the potential for agreement is being distanced. And one of the things that we talk about regularly in our sessions, and because Rivca was talking about how what has become habitual, it didn't happen overnight. It's a system and a systematic practicing of. The thing about upwording is that if you're engaging with it as a practice and the intent behind it, then the blaming and shaming goes away. There's a reminding, there's a noticing, there's a building up of what we talked about earlier, of awareness, both in yourself and in others, without the labelling of, oh, well, you got that wrong. It's simply a question of, we've slipped back into the old habit, which, as Rivca said, often comes because of external pressures and or pressures we place on ourselves. And that's what habits do. When in doubt, go back to.
Of course.
That's why it's a habit.
Something that did strike me there as we were talking about this, within the vocabulary and the lexicon of upwording, is there a word that describes words that shouldn't be used because their connotation is negative? But then again, should you use that word because are we not trying to do away with negative connotations?
Should or shouldn't?
It's important to have a descriptor for words that should less habitually be used because the connotation is disruptive, or I'm trying to avoid using the word negative.
Yeah, it was the should actually.
It's
So
the
one
use of the word
important,
should.
yeah,
Yeah.
really important is that this is in no way about what somebody should or shouldn't do. Otherwise, we're becoming prescriptive again,
Yeah.
like you said before. And actually, that is also where NLP can become quite prescriptive
Yeah.
and also coercive. At its best, it doesn't. Or
Just
let's say in the hands of.
That's the point I was trying to make
Yeah.
about like the diet is a very explicit,
Yeah.
very easy to understand example of that. Somebody telling you to eat quinoa and say, I have
Yeah.
£1, I can't afford quinoa.
Yeah. And also to say eat quinoa, you will be healthy. And actually people are different, and for some quinoa doesn't
Yeah.
work at all.
Yeah.
So no, we would definitely never go, you should, to oneself. No, it's an invitation to go, notice what happens when those words are present and what we are inadvertently upholding, that many, an increasing number of people want to change, want to shift away from hierarchical superiority-driven systems. Number one, am I actually still supporting them? Two, what is it doing to us?
And so instead of should or shouldn't, we talk about shifts. So instead of, what might we shift to?
Okay. Right.
As opposed to which word should or shouldn't we use. Accept the word is there and is used. What would be more beneficial? What would help to move towards?
So all the vocabulary you were asking, or you said
Yeah.
lexicon, I quite like that as well, but the vocabulary is all the vocabulary that we already know.
Okay.
It is all the things that are within our, like, I want to, I would like to, as we mentioned. I can't wait to, I don't want to, I might choose to refuse to do something as well. So I take much more active conscious choice. It would be things like moving from everyone, always, all the time, to there have been times when I have noticed, when I have done.
Yeah.
There have been times I've noticed I have had a tendency to. It might imply or say up until now. It leaves it open for something else to happen.
For that shift.
Or that shift. If I go, this always happens, or I always do, or everybody always, or never, I have not only closed it down to being something that cannot change, I've also predicted the future.
Yeah.
I've done crystal ball thinking this will always happen.
Yeah.
So I've really limited. So the whole thing is about moving away from limitations to things that are liberating.
And sometimes you can do that by use of tense. So, I have in the past. Up till now, I have.
Oh, okay.
So far, I've been inclined to. That leaves the possibility that I can change it.
Yeah.
Not only that change is possible, that it's within my agency. So you move away from that kind of, I'm shackled to this, it
Yeah.
will never change,
Yeah.
I'm resigned, that's my life, it's over.
Yeah.
To the possibilities. What are the possibilities?
Including, I always get angry. Well, maybe the I always get angry hasn't served me or somebody else particularly well. And maybe I don't want to get angry, because the other sentences probably will be, and I don't want to get angry every time, but I always get angry. I'm using those words in particular. So how about if I go, right up until now, I've had a tendency to be angry when I hear or see da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
Okay, what can I do? How would I like to respond differently? How do I want to be more resourceful in those moments? Etc.
How would I like to be? There's an immediate invitation. So we come right back to where we started out, that the whole concept is based on that sense of it being a proposition, an exploration of options, rather than a diktat. It will be done like this.
Another example would be, because it came up just before, binaries, polarized binaries. Again, I may realize that I actually choose not to upkeep binary thinking and polarized thinking. Therefore, what can I do instead? So instead of a classic one is it's good or bad. It's right or wrong.
Yeah.
You can also go according to whom. So many frustrations and tensions come about because people go, that's really good, and somebody else goes, no, it's not. So now we're battling who's right, who's wrong, is the righter or the wronger. When actually can only really be my personal preference at that moment, and it might change. So if I start owning it, then I can go, I prefer, I like, I enjoyed, I can own it.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that film. I love that film.
Yeah.
I don't require to go, that was a great film. I might still go, that was a great film, with an intention of going, I really, really loved it. I'm not saying, now that was a great film, and that was a bad film. You can hear the tone, you can hear the intention. One is educational and the other one is joyful. Same word.
It's also feels very relevant to right now in terms of how people communicate with each other on the internet. Because that is a massive arena of communication. But really the modes of communication and the methods that people use to communicate, and for instance Twitter, or just social media in general, but for instance Twitter is a really good example. But also stuff like the comment sections of YouTube and stuff. There's, it's, I don't know how to articulate it exactly, but I think it's a very important conversation to be had at the moment, because people are fielding personal opinions like they're gospel. Because I think in a way, maybe I don't know why, has the internet trained us to be like that? Is it?
I think it's, as Rivca said before, it's always been there. I think what it's done is perhaps brought it more to the fore. It's definitely ensured that when you take a position that is right or wrong, you immediately move into camps, and then you can look at how many people come into your camp as opposed to going to the other camp.
Yeah.
So that comparator and that desire to be seen, to belong, is increased.
Yeah.
The idea that I like something and therefore I might invite you also to like it is a different perspective from it's good. If you're not in my camp, then you're in that other camp, and by definition, if I think this is good and you think it's bad, we can't be in the same camp.
Yeah.
So if we choose to move away from the one or other, the either or, this camp and that camp, the two camps, and we can start practicing, and I think that is something to practice, because we are making a generalization here, there seems to not have been yet as much practice in multifarious communication as I would love to engage in the future. We may go, well, actually, I had this and that experience, I have this and that preference, this is my reading of it. Is there a different one? And is there another one that is different? And there's another differing one. And then we can start seeing where they overlap, because there'll always be some kind of, there will be, that's interesting. No, there will not always be an overlap. There may well be overlap, and because I choose to look for overlap and connection, I'll probably find connection, rather than looking for the disconnection of, well, I'm in that camp because that one is wrong. So I may find more connection with people who have a differing view to mine, because I'm looking for differing views.
It also opens up that whole area of diversity, which is very much a buzz expression. I'll deviate ever so slightly, because diversity is one of those things that I refer to as an umbrella word or a suitcase word. What I mean in this instance is it opens up the possibility for there to be a multiplicity of either perspectives and or experiences.
Yeah.
And for that to be what we engage with and what we explore, as opposed to setting up barriers by taking positions in camps.
Yeah. That seems, I'm just thinking about the connotations of what that means, and it seems like that does seem like a very positive outlook to have at the moment, particularly, like I said, when you're used to, I spend a lot of my life online because it's where a lot of my business is, to be able to maintain that perspective in that scenario seems really, really important, actually, and quite pressing for where we are right now, in terms of, without wanting to fall into negative language, but the opposite of that, or where that could go in a negative sense, is really, really pressing and could be very, very bad. And to me, in certain senses, it feels like we are actually witnessing that happen in the world right now. So that...
Very much so.
Yeah, very much so.
Almost in any field that you engage. I mean, the political sphere is the immediate and obvious one.
Yeah. But even the social sphere, like how it's bleeding into that.
And into relationships.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's one of the reasons why when we talk about upwording, we say that it's of benefit in almost any set of circumstances you care to look at. It's a beneficial to one's own self-awareness. Mm-hmm. It's beneficial within the context of family relationships. It's beneficial within the context of social relationships, work relationship. Name the area where interaction goes on and where language is used. Mm. And what we're talking about with regard to upwording can apply.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I feel like it applies across the board. It applies in all these areas.
And if we choose to engage in upwording, in the practice, in the noticing, in the shifting, in, I think what was mentioned also, maybe choosing to archive some of the words or even compost them. Some people mention, or retire them altogether, or use them with a lot more care and understanding. Recycle them, yeah. And really check our intention in that moment. Then the conversations that have the multiple views and preferences can happen because they'll be towards a mutually agreeable something. Mm. It may take a while to have a mutually agreeable outcome. Mm. We may find a mutually agreeable stage or place. So rather than battling with one another as to who is right or wrong or what should or shouldn't happen according to, we can begin to move together to something that, and I'm going to jump a little bit here, could be a desirable world for all.
Yeah.
I think also that one of the things that, you were talking about the kind of wider social circumstance, and you made reference to what happened during the pandemic. Mm. One of the things that came up during that time was how important it can be for a cohesive society that we collaborate.
Yeah.
In order to collaborate, to facilitate collaboration, what we're talking about is beneficial. If you're not going to, dig your trench and be in your camp, it is far more likely that you will find the place where you can collaborate.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If you are open to the idea that yours isn't the only way, that there isn't a right or a wrong way, there are differing perspectives, the potential for us then to work out, and within those different perspectives, what's common, therefore what can we do together, is heightened.
Yeah.
What I do wanted to just mention, because we're also here at the mill and within the context of the mill, and certainly the four of us are really engaging very consciously in upwording. Others have done it up to a point as well, yourself and others, by coming to a session or listening to the podcast. That's already there. We have one in English and one in German. We'll have them in more languages soon. Or by osmosis, by being around and just noticing something and picking it up. One of the things that we will want to start doing is to have what we would call the crucial critical conversations that we have started, I think about like nearly 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, and rolled out to do, which is for whatever group or team or community or network of people who actually wish to have conversations on the hot topics where people are often at the moment at loggerheads, and that could be about vaccination still, or masks, or trans or
Diversity,
when or what diversity
that
and
means.
so on, is that they can actually be had with an understanding of how to engage in the communication, in the listening, in the adding on to, in the seeking for more. And we call it specifically crucial critical conversations, rather than difficult and challenging. And that's another really upwording choice, because if I go, it's going to, we're dealing with difficult or challenging conversation, you've already brought in that they will be difficult and they will be challenging. And there will be conflict. So that is something we would like to make happen at the Mill, I think, as soon as it can be open now to the public again, which is sometime next year when we've got the lift and everything, and then have those crucial critical conversations facilitated where people can learn to have them and have them.
I think because of what Rivca said about the four... what's your label? The four of you.
I was actually quite. I didn't go. I'm an artistic director. I said we are sharing the artistic director role or the artistic directorship. I'm working on it.
Artistic directorship. One of the interesting things about that group of people then being receptive to the idea of upwording is that it seemed to make sense, and indeed some of the sharings of the early iterations of this is what we mean by upwording, here are the practices that we're engaging with. It seems to make sense that, for want of a better term, that upwording is effectively housed within the Mill. That the Mill becomes, the word I think I used way back was a petri dish for how that engagement with upwording can be beneficial and or disseminated to a wider audience, a wider constituency. So that's part of the relationship that upwording will have with this place.
Yeah.
And the impact already has been that because we are really consciously considering what we do and not do, it has led to decisions to not go for a particular fund. Because we've removed we have to because it's there.
Yeah. And I've been around and seen and heard some of these conversations, so this is actually making a lot of practical sense to me now when I see it in this way. Taking out the we have to get this funding. It's like, do we really? And also that's something that's very applicable in my own life as an artist. It's like, I have to get, do I? And just kind of like challenging those I don't know if desire is the right way to...
Well, it is. It's a consideration of actually, do we want to get into bed with that funder, or do we want to uphold those criteria, that whether it's a funder or a contract or whatever, and also do we have the capacity? Because if we're actually so for me, I choose to refuse to accept that stress is an acceptable part of working. It is not acceptable. Therefore, it's not about how do we manage stress, it's how can we avoid stress in the first place and recognise there's periods of stretch.
Can I quote you on that?
You absolutely can. I refuse.
Can we get that put on the plaque?
Yeah. I run a little workshop called SOS, Stress or Stretch and Sprint. Okay. And there is a real difference to go, no, stress is not acceptable. It is really unhealthy. So therefore, let's do everything that we can to avoid people going into stress. Stress meaning ongoing periods of having too much, as well as using language that also adds to the very stress. So it's actions and language. So what can we do? We can shift the way we speak about things and towards one another. We can also make sure that people aren't beyond capacity. So yes, there are moments when there will be a sprint. There are moments that are a stretch, maybe for 2 or 3 weeks. It is not ongoing. Therefore, we will not go for this fund. Therefore, we will not go for this project, or we will go for this project in a different way. Because actually, no, we don't have to. We are choosing to.
Yeah.
And we want everybody else to do the choosing as well.
This actually seems like a very good point to end at. You have answered this already, but I was wanting to ask you, where do you see upwarding going? Because we talked about where does upwarding come from, and the obvious flip side of that question is where is it going? But I think you've actually articulated that really well, specifically with the involvement with Islington Mill. There are some things in our sheets that we haven't covered. But I think we should just stop now, because I think I would like to continue this conversation again in a future podcast as well. And if you're up for that, I would
Definitely.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.
And I'll be speaking to you both again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you now. That was great.